Today we're going to talk about milling or cutting accuracy on the table saw. And I started with the table saw because it's probably, if not the most used piece of equipment in the shop for cutting materials. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you would. Take a second and hit the subscribe button. If you like this video and if it's helped you in any ways, please hit the like button. So whether you have a benchtop table saw, contractor's table saw, or a hybrid table saw, or a cabinet maker's table saw like I have here, the methods we're going to talk about are the same throughout all of them. Okay? Whether the adjustment technique may be a little bit different from saw to saw, but the method and the principle is the same for all of them. So the first thing we're going to talk about is getting the saw blade. And in this case, I'm using a saw blade because I know it's flat, or it's very flat. You can also purchase machine pieces of discs that are perfectly flat, or as close to perfectly flat as you can get, to use in place of the saw blade. Now, in this case, you'll notice that I use a forest blade. And if you've never heard of a forest blade, and if you can afford a forest blade for your table saw, please go out and get one, because you'll love them. I've used all kinds of blades. I've used the Diablos, I've used Irwins, I've used all kinds of different blades. And when I stumbled upon forest, I don't know, probably 7, 8 years ago, as soon as I put the blade on the saw and got it squared up, I absolutely fell in love with it. They cut amazingly well. They cut through anything, and I just love the blade. Now, the Forest isn't paying me for this, and I don't get any sponsorship or anything like that. So, like I said, check them out. And they have different kerf widths, and depending upon your saw, they're a little pricey, but they're worth every penny of it. They're sharp, sharp, sharp blades. All right, so the first thing we have to do is we have to get the miter gauge track parallel, or as close to parallel as we can, to the saw blade. Or like I said, the machine disc you can use in place of if you don't know your saw blade's good and flat. So you can see that I've got the saw raised as high as it can go, and I've got, let me just show you how this works. You got these two pins right in that slot right there, and they self-center themselves inside the miter gauge slot. So once I have that in there, no matter what variation the slot has, will follow along through the blade. Now, this has got, you can see it's a V-shaped rib that sits down in that slot like that. And it touches the blade, and then we'll go ahead and zero it. Once we have that zeroed, now we're just going to run this along the blade, and you can see that throughout the whole blade, whoops, we're off the blade there. Throughout the entire blade, let's go back to here. Throughout the entire blade, I am pretty much dead center. Okay? I'm not even 1/1000th off from the very beginning of the blade to the very end of the blade. Now, had I been off, let's say I had been off more than 10/1000ths, to me is too much. My limit is about 5/1000ths. Now, you can see by that, we were basically 1/1000th off, maybe 2/1000th off at the most. Okay, now that we've established that I'm almost dead parallel to the blade, the table is dead parallel to the blade, we can go on to the next step. Now let's just say that it wasn't dead parallel. Let's say I was off 10 or 15 or 20 or 30/1000ths of an inch, which may not sound like a lot, but when you're ripping an 8-foot board, that's a lot from one end to another. And when we get done with this, I'm going to go ahead and rip a piece of wood, and we'll see just how accurate the saw is from one end to another. But let's just say let's say the saw was off from the table to the blade. More than, I don't know, this sounds crazy, but I usually say more than 5 or 8, between 5 and 10 thousandths. I'm readjusting my table to make sure I'm in line or in parallel again. All right, so how do you do it? It's very simple. If you'll look, your tabletop or your saw, no matter what kind of saw it is, bench top, contractors, cabinet saw, is bolted to the base somehow, okay? And what you're going to do is loosen those bolts, and there's usually 4 of them, and you're going to tap with a hammer, just like a little rubber mallet, and you're just going to tap the table to get it in parallel with the miter gauge slot. And then you're going to run your gauge down that miter gauge slot again until it comes in parallel. Now this is going to take a little time. You're going to have to figure out which corner to tap, which corner brings you back in parallel, which corner you tap to get you out of parallel, and it's going to take a little experimentation. I wouldn't loosen the bolts very much. Just get them a little loose. You don't want them loose, because you want to be able to tap it and kind of hold that table in place. You know, you don't want to be able to just let the table flop around. Okay, so that's what you do. And then once you get it in parallel, you tighten the table back down, recheck your setting, and you should be, right at 0, or as close to 0 as you can get it. The closest to 0 you can get, the better the cut of the table, the saw is going to be. I see people all the time that have poor cuts, burned wood, things of that nature. This is the reason why. The closer to being perfect in parallel you can get, the better it's going to be. Now I've got the fence set up, and I've got the dial indicator zeroed out, or pretty much zeroed out. There we go, 0. And what I'm going to do is take this gauge and run along this miter track, okay, and see how we do as far as accuracy here is concerned. And you can see the gauge moving in and out just a little bit, and that's because there's variance in the fence material. And you can see that's about 4 thousandths. And that's because there's a variance in the fence material. This material here that's along the fence, the HV, what is it, high molecular, I can't remember the acronym for it, but it's not perfectly flat. So the dial indicator is picking up some variance in that fence. One of these days I'm going to make myself a new fence using some of that 80-20 material, that extruded aluminum stuff that's perfectly flat. We'll see how well I can get it. So we're about 4 thousandths out, and that was drifting away from the blade, which is kind of what you want. You want a little bit of drift on the fence, just a little bit away from the blade. That way you don't get any binding. And in my experience, it works the best. So now you've got the fence set up. It's parallel as you can to the miter track. You've got the blade set up, and now we're going to cut a little bit of wood and we'll see what it looks like. All right. So we're going to take a piece of lumber now, and now that we got our fence tuned up, or our table saw tuned up, we're going to take this piece of pine. It's about 7.5 feet long, or 7 feet long. And we're going to run it through both sides. And then we're going to take a dial indicator to it and see what our measurements are on both sides. All right. See the dial indicator is set to 0. Let's take a measurement here. We can get some. There we go. 4363. Let's go down to here. See if we can get down here. 4361. So we're 2/1000ths of an inch between one edge of the lumber to the next, and that's on about a 7-foot board. So that's pretty good. Now, if you can get that accuracy from your saw, then you're doing great. Okay, so today we've learned how to tune up our table saw to get us better, more accurate precision cuts in order for our assembly to go better for our projects, and for our projects to turn out better, and have a little less frustration when we're putting together our projects from misaligned cuts and cuts that just didn't turn out very well. We've learned that with just a little bit of time and patience, we can get cuts just like this 7-foot pine board within 2/1000ths of an inch front to back. So I thank you for watching. If any of this was helpful to you, please hit the like button and please subscribe to our channel. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.